Alright, I honestly didn't have an issue with Sunny's Mr. Beast / Chris Tyson video like many others did. Though, his recent video about the Impaulsive podcast? Yeah, it was a completely L take and really rubbed me the wrong way. Ayo, it's Joe, aka Mad Joe FC. So a few videos I uploaded before this one was a video of me discussing my thoughts and opinions about the video well-known YouTuber SunnyV2 made about the Mr. Beast and Chris Tyson situation. In that video, I didn't side with or defend Sunny, though I had just stated that it seemed to me that Sunny approached talking about that topic from an objective and business perspective. That's how he tries to approach topics he discusses in his videos, and it felt like that's the approach he had when talking about how Chris Tyson coming out as being trans could potentially affect the Mr. Beast brand. For my full discussion about that situation, you can watch that video by clicking the card in the top right corner, and I'll also have the video linked in the description box of this video. So, quite a few videos after that video, Sunny made another video about a sensitive and controversial topic. I was surprised by it because I figured after the massive backlash he got from the Mr. Beast / Chris Tyson video, he would dial back on doing videos talking about anything too sensitive. Well, he recently uploaded a video talking about the drama revolving around Logan Paul's Impaulsive podcast, and in my opinion, it was a huge flop. Just to quickly summarize the drama for those who might not know about it, a stand-up comedian named George Janko was the third host of Logan Paul's podcast, being the replacement for two previous people who had served as the third host. The drama surrounding the podcast was a result of George being repeatedly bullied by multiple guests of the podcast, as well as the two main hosts of it. It eventually reached a boiling point when George walked off a podcast where the guest, Bobby Lee, had first initiated unnecessary beef by saying George isn't cool. It started with that, and then it quickly spiraled into Bobby straight up making fun of and belittling George, after he had stood his ground and fired back at Bobby with insults of his own. After that, Bobby apologized to George, and when George had also apologized for walking off on the guest, Bobby had rudely taken back his apology. After that ordeal, George and Logan had some drama regarding religion, and there was then just a snowball effect of internal drama between the hosts of the podcast, which had ultimately resulted in George leaving Impaulsive altogether to start his own podcast. So yeah, very messy situation, and I feel that Sunny did a terrible job with his presentation about the drama. I could understand Sunny approaching this topic from a business perspective of how the drama with George could potentially negatively affect the podcast, similar to how he approached the Mr. Beast and Chris Tyson drama. Though, Sunny's Impaulsive video just felt very biased and one-sided. It felt like he had set a narrative that George was completely in the wrong and that he was being arrogant and too sensitive regarding being made fun of by guests and the other hosts. So much so that George's insecurities were ruining the podcast. I don't at all agree with that take, and I feel that Logan, Mike, and different guests all unnecessarily roasting George is what was ruining the podcast. I've never watched any episodes of the podcast for two reasons. One, I had no idea it even existed until Sunny's video about it, and B, even if I had known about it, I certainly wouldn't have intentionally watched it. Knowing it's Logan Paul's podcast and knowing he's a person I cannot stand for multiple reasons. Though, from what I did see of the podcast in Sunny's video, it is very undoubtedly clear that on a moral level, it was an extremely disgusting and toxic work environment. From the time George began as the third host, all the way until his departure, he was clearly humiliated and disrespected throughout all of it. The clips of the episode with Shaq as their guest really shocked me and made me do a double take, Like, I was genuinely appalled seeing Shaq being such a bully. Like, what the frick? I don't know too much about Shaq. I've never watched any basketball games with him in it because I don't watch sports at all, and I've never seen him act in anything either except for that general insurance commercial. So my knowledge on him is limited, but from everything that I have seen of him, and knowing how much he helps people and will randomly purchase major items for people in stores, I had the idea that he was just one of the nicest, kindest souls to walk the earth. Then I see him on Logan's podcast, and it's like I'm seeing a completely different person. Like, what? I know he is a person who likes to joke around with people, as I've seen him do with other celebrities like Kevin Hart. Though, the way he was speaking to George, that wasn't him just messing around. Him repeatedly telling George why is he even there, and then saying he needs to put in his 2 weeks notice, that was nothing less than just being rude and cruel. It felt very off and out of character for Shaq to be behaving like that, and that interaction alone has made my respect for him plummet quite a bit. Very uncool, Shaq. My thing is, I'm a person who has an extremely low tolerance for anyone being unnecessarily rude, inconsiderate, or disrespectful to someone who didn't do or say anything wrong to justify or validate it. It's something that pretty much almost every single person on the planet does to others on a regular basis, and it very highly triggers me. I always do my best to never be unnecessarily rude, inconsiderate, or disrespectful to anyone who hasn't said or done anything wrong to me to justify it. Because I know that I can't stand it when people do it to me and to others. So knowing that Logan, Mike, and different guests on the podcast were being rude, inconsiderate, and disrespectful to George literally just for the heck of it, it bothers me very much. Like, if I was a guest on their podcast and George wasn't saying a peep while sitting right next to me, I would not have been an absolute doucheburger like Shaq was. I honestly probably wouldn't have even said anything to George if he hadn't said anything to me. If he doesn't speak, then he just doesn't speak. Jeez. There are 2 other hosts to talk to. I understand he was a host and is literally his job to ask questions, but it's not like it's the end of the world just because he isn't speaking. As a guest, it wouldn't be my responsibility to address him about being a silent host. That responsibility falls on Logan. I would simply just be respectful to George and not make any unnecessary remarks to him just because he isn't saying anything. If I was to speak to him, then I would have simply and politely invited him into the conversation instead of being a butt wipe. Shaq's remarks were made in a very cold-hearted tone and really showed how inconsiderate he was to George. Not considering the thought of, hey, this guy's a human being, and human beings have feelings and emotions. People handle their feelings and emotions differently than others. Maybe I should be more thoughtful. George had never done or said anything wrong to Shaq to validate him being a bully. He did it just because. And that really ticks me off. Then next was the beef between George and Bobby, which I already discussed during my summarization of the entire Impaulsive drama. It was the exact same thing that happened with Shaq. The guest starts unnecessarily roasting and belittling George for absolutely no reason, when he didn't do or say anything wrong to them to justify them being a straight up bully. This is where I want to get into why I legitimately feel that Sunny was painting a biased narrative in his video, making it seem as if George is in the wrong. During the clips with George and Bobby, Sunny had said that after Bobby's first few roasts, George is the one who took it to borderline aggressive by what he had said next to Bobby. Really, Sunny? George is the one who took it to borderline aggressive? What about the podcast with Shaq when he repeatedly said, "What the frick are you doing here?" Mind you, it got to the point where he was saying that in an aggressive tone, not a joking tone. So what? We're just going to say it's fine for the guest to be borderline aggressive to the host, who is constantly bullied, but then when the host finally stands his ground and fires back with an aggressive insult of his own is a problem? Basically, throughout the entire video, Sunny was making a point that George's arrogance and insecurities were the problem with the podcast. No, his arrogance and insecurities were not the problem. The problem was his quote, friends, Logan and what's-his-face, constantly laughing at their guests bullying George, which was pretty much them encouraging and enabling it to continue. If they were truly his friends, or at least considerate hosts, they would have stepped in and put a stop to the roasting and insults. But they were not his friends, because true friends are not toxic towards you or your beliefs. True friends are at least considerate and respectful of you and your beliefs, though that doesn't mean they agree with all your opinions about different things. It's called respectfully agreeing to disagree. Multiple times, George had really opened up and shared personal feelings, and he got clowned on. Yeah, guess what? True friends don't do that to their friends. Logan and his simp buddy were not George's friends. They were bumhole hosts who constantly and agreeably laughed like trained parrots at the zoo every time a guest had disrespected or straight up bullied George. It's so easy to tell that Logan was just using George as a punching bag and target for his guests to rag on, just so their guests would like them. Them allowing their friend to be mentally picked apart on the show like that really shows how desperate they are to fit in with whichever guest they have. Then there's what's-his-face. I believe his name is Mike. I apologize in advance for all the kind, polite, and respectful people out there with the name Mike, but what I'm about to ask is something I've realized for a few years now. Why the frick is almost every rude, arrogant, disrespectful douchebag named Mike? Seriously, why? Logan's friend Mike is the ultimate yes man. Him and Logan are a literal definition of a man and his dong. Wait, I meant to say a man and his dog. D-O-G. From the clips I saw of the podcast and Sunny's video, pretty much all Mike does on Impaulsive is agree with whatever Logan says and laughs with him to the point where he's leaning on him whenever one of their guests says anything Logan thinks is remotely funny. Last, there's George. I know it sounds like I'm defending George in this video, and yeah, I am. Though, that doesn't mean I think he was completely innocent in all the drama. Yes, he could have handled things better regarding his temper and arrogance when having certain jokes said about him and how he responds to those jokes. Though, at the end of the day, he was on the podcast to essentially be mindless cannon fodder, a dartboard. Different guests, as well as the other two hosts, didn't respect or care at all about George's feelings, emotions, or anything he had to say. He was treated as if he was a lame, inferior, third-wheel background character in comparison to his two co-hosts. When Logan and Mike started seeing George become visibly upset by all the back-to-back jokes, they should have immediately broke the tension between George and the guests in the moment and put a stop to it. George had made it clear after the episode with Shaq that he was feeling insecure and was lacking confidence in his ability to be a good third host. If Logan and Mike were good and caring friends, they should have talked with him off camera to give him support and courage to feel more confident in himself. Instead, they used his personal struggles, vulnerability, and insecurities as ammunition for more rude and inconsiderate jokes to be made by their guests. Care, kindness, compassion, empathy, respect. George Janko received none of that from his friends, as well as multiple guests. He was endlessly roasted whether he did or didn't speak, yet had kept a calm composure. Then when he finally plants his foot in the mud and barks back with mildly aggressive insults of his own, and then shows he's had enough of the ignorance and emotional pain he's endured throughout the history of the podcast by walking out, he's criticized for it. What? I think that George finally leaving the podcast was a W decision and was the best decision for his mental well-being. Because, men's mental health is something that actually matters. Too bad most younger men are being raised by their older boomer fathers who think that men shouldn't ever express their feelings or emotions, and should instead suppress it inside and remain tough and hardened. That's a topic I would love to make a whole video about one day. From the start, George was in a toxic and unhealthy work environment, showing up every podcast just to constantly be picked on and made fun of by the co-hosts and guests, while they're all laughing at him. I can understand a few playful one-off jokes and teases that don't push things too far. That wasn't happening though. It was constant roasting, which at points turned into straight-up bullying and was honestly at times at least felt like borderline harassment. No average person would want to go through all that every time they're on a podcast. Like George would do on Logan's podcast, I'm gonna open up here and get personal for just a minute. When I was in school, I was the victim of bullying. I had a total of 3. 1 in 1st grade, 1 in 2nd grade, and my final one in the 6th grade. The first one my father got involved with, which resulted in it stopping. The second one kinda just fizzled out and wasn't too terrible anyway. The third and final bully I had was without a doubt the worst of them all, and had stopped when one day I had enough of his BS, stood him in the face, and was ready to fist fight him before the teacher saw and separated us. I had yelled aggressively to his face that I had enough of his crap, and after the teacher split us apart, I never had another bully again from that day until now. After that, I told myself I would always stand up for myself against anyone being unnecessarily rude, inconsiderate, or disrespectful to me. My point in sharing that about me was to drive home that I can very much relate to how George must have felt every time he was sitting there completely vulnerable on the podcast, with no help or support from his friends. With all 3 bullies I had, I would absolutely dread going to that specific class each day just to be teased and picked on for no reason. I'm sure George had dreaded driving to set each day, knowing the cruel jokes and insults he had waiting for him once each podcast would begin. So yeah, I am so happy he finally got away from his toxic, quote, friends, who are narcissistic, arrogant, belittled, and had no respect for him. In my eyes, moving on from that podcast and pursuing his own endeavors is a major W. So now to conclude this video by looping things back around to Sunny. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it felt as if Sunny had set a biased narrative that George was completely in the wrong, and that him being arrogant and sensitive regarding being made fun of repeatedly by guests and the other host was ruining the podcast. He didn't at all mention anything about how everyone's repeated jokes towards George could have been seen as bullying or verbal harassment. And that's mainly what really didn't sit right with me. So, Sunny can go the entire video talking about how George and his actions or retaliations to being ignored, insulted, and bullied shows why he isn't a good fit for the podcast, but can't even once bring up the thoughts that maybe the co-hosts and guests of the podcast were maybe being unnecessarily harsh and cruel to him? Nah, that ain't it, Chief. That's what I call biased and one-sided. I saw the video in the form of Sunny presenting the drama in favor of Logan and the guests, instead of presenting it solely from an objective perspective without leaning in favor of a specific side. I'm just having a difficult time understanding why Sunny is making it seem as if all the drama with George versus essentially the entire podcast was having a heavily negative impact on it. There were already 2 different third hosts before George, and the podcast floated along just fine when both of them left. Yeah, those other hosts didn't have a slew of drama revolving around them, but it isn't like the drama with George was really harming the viewership or audience engagement with the podcast in any significant way. People mainly just roasted him in the comment section of different episodes of Impaulsive, and that was pretty much it. It isn't like there was any large amount of negative reception towards the podcast, like how there was a large amount of negative reception within the Mr. Beast fan base when Chris Tyson came out as being trans and started showing that within different videos. Again, to hear my full discussion about that situation and understand my stance on Sunny's video he made about the drama, watch my other video I made about Sunny. It will be in a card at the top right corner of the screen, as well as in the description box of this video. I just feel that Sunny's Impaulsive video really exaggerated the ramifications and effect of George leaving the podcast. Like I said, I haven't seen a single episode of Impaulsive and never will. But from the clips Sunny showed of the podcast after George's departure, it seemed as if the podcast was doing just fine. If they already went through the exits of and process of finding 2 different third hosts, then they can do it again. They can find a new third host and the podcast will continue as normal. I don't think at all that Bobby Lee's one joke in George's departure collapsed the Impaulsive podcast. In my other video about Sunny, I had said that after his Chris Tyson video, I was going to start being a lot more cautious and critical when listening to how he talks about whichever person the video is focused on. Well, this video is proof that I was serious about that. I had also said that nothing he said in his video about the Chris Tyson situation was terrible or drastic enough to the point that I thought to myself, he's gone a bit too far and that I'm going to unsub from his channel. Well, his Impaulsive video focusing on George Janko may have completely changed my tune. I'm still not going to unsub as of now because while the video and his take on the situation was a massive L, he still does upload some bangers too every now and then. Mainly his videos that aren't focused on highly sensitive and controversial topics. His slightly aggressive toned video about Ninja was strike 1 for me, and his video framing George Janko as being the one primarily responsible for the drama revolving around the Impaulsive podcast was without a doubt strike number 2. So if he makes one more stinker video of him being heavily biased towards a specific person, instead of discussing the situation from solely an objective and mutual perspective, then yeah, I'll probably unsub. Him being biased wouldn't matter to me if the premise of his channel was simply him discussing his personal opinions about different topics. Though that isn't his channel's premise. In his videos, he presents each topic of discussion as if he's documenting it from a factual standpoint, from a perspective of whatever he's saying is absolutely correct, without any personal opinions. That's how he presents his videos, though it's often clear when he cherry picks specific clips of people for his videos and sprinkles in his own personal thoughts to point a certain narrative he wants people to think. So yeah, Sunny's Impaulsive video was an L. I really didn't vibe with the biased presentation of it because that's not the premise he aims for in his videos. I'm hoping he can cut back on letting his bias seep through into his quote, commentary/documentary style videos. Though, at this point, I just think the pattern will continue to repeat itself. I hope you enjoyed watching and post in the comments any questions or thoughts you have about what I said in the video. Also, post your thoughts about the whole Impaulsive situation and Sunny's take on it. I'd like to see what you say. Alright, that's it. Good times and positive vibes, everyone. Stay humble. Stay grateful.